we've got plenty of time for...
Yeah, I wanted to make sure there was discussion time. Great. You liked it all?
So can I ask a sort of practical question?
Absolutely.
About facts even? Right, so 2,000 feet from a park.
Yeah.
And do we believe that this actually has any effect? Is the claim there? I guess there's two facts I want to understand.
Okay.
One is about who is it that abuses children and how
Okay.
often it's strangers, such that knowing where they live is actually in and of itself safe. And two, does that mean that we're suggesting that children playing in parks tempt sexual abusers? And is that an okay way to describe children? As temptresses? I guess boys are tempters, I don't know.
Yeah. Well, as far as the percentage of children who are abused by strangers, the percentage just flew out of my head, but it's the vast minority of sexual abuse and assault cases. And this is the work of somebody like Jill Levinson is looking at. For a child to be abused or assaulted, oftentimes what happens is that a lot of adults are cultivated in a situation. So you'll hear stories like, well, I knew the coach wasn't quite, wasn't okay. I had some feelings about him, but I kind of looked the other way from adults interviewed after the fact. So that cultivation of other adults is what Generation 5 really breaks into really well. So stranger abuse and assault certainly happens, but it's really the minority of cases. And community building is actually really effective at preventing that because children are often supervised, especially young children, right? So if we have a community accountability model, then anybody can intercede into a situation that looks like it's devolving in some way. But as far as do these restrictions work, what Jill Levinson's work in particular has shown is that there is no correlation between living near a school or a park or a daycare center and recidivism. There's no correlation.
I can just walk 2,100 feet to the park if I really wanted to.
You could live
Or
across
just
the,
become a
her research shows you could live across the street from a park and it's not going to affect your recidivism rate. What's going to affect your recidivism rate is whether you have a job, whether you're in family relationships, whether you have people holding you accountable day after day. That's going to affect recidivism. Right? So it's not the spatial management isn't making us safer. It is though, you'll notice, the strategy that gets employed over and over and over again. So LA is basically, people on the sex offender registry simply can't live there legally at this point. And this is why we start getting clusters. I don't know if anybody's been following. There's all this news coverage now of sex offender clusters. So this is people driven out of cities into like trailer parks on the edge of town where they're not close to a school or a daycare center or a park. And then people want to bust those. They want to break those up. Where are people going to go? Please, and then at your hand, yeah.
I failed to hear what exactly Generation 5 is doing. Are they promoting getting jobs then for child sex offenders and holding them accountable? I mean, I heard all these principles, but I didn't hear what exactly are they doing? Are they actively trying to pursue this in 5 generations? I mean,
Yeah, they are.
What exactly are
Yeah,
they doing?
so they're located both in San Francisco and Atlanta. So they're people working within their own communities to practice these community accountability principles. So they'll do things like come up with plans. It's quite arduous to practice community accountability. It requires people gathering over and over again with a person who's committed harm, if the person who has been harmed wants to be involved in the process, sometimes even in the absence of the person. So I'll give you a concrete example that doesn't actually come from Generation 5, but that comes from one of their sister organizations, Community Against Rape and Assault in Seattle. So Communities Against Rape and Assault in Seattle were called into a punk music community where 2 sexual assaults had occurred. And it wasn't even either of, in this case, young women who had been assaulted. It was one of their friends asked for an accountability process within the punk music community. And the perpetrator, the person who had committed the harms, just left, moved out of Seattle during this accountability process. They could never get that person to sit down at the table and really involve themselves in an honest community accountability process. So we might say failure, right? Total failure. Except that what happened within the punk music community that was really amazing is they started doing all these meetings about victim blaming, sexual assault, what consent means, and this community had a newsletter, a newspaper that they produced pretty regularly. And when the assaults first happened, it was a pretty popular promoter in that community that committed the assaults. And the newspaper rallied around him, as did most of the community, to blame the victims. They shouldn't have been there, they shouldn't have been drinking, they shouldn't have been wearing that. And through the community accountability work, what happened is that the discourse really changed around that. That people began to talk about, well, maybe it doesn't matter what somebody's wearing, right? Maybe somebody could be able to show up at our clubs naked and not have to worry about sexual assault. These kinds of conversations were facilitated over months in this community. So we might think of this as like consciousness raising work and a change in community norms. Now, that person wasn't brought to account in a sense that we might think of as really satisfying. But what did happen is that community changed. So most sexual assault isn't going to go through any formal litigation, right? The majority of cases don't get any kind of satisfactory legal resolution. But what did happen in this case is that the whole community was changed in response to it. So that's like a concrete case of working on 2 assaults. One of the people harmed eventually became involved in the community accountability process. The perpetrator steps out, and yet things changed significantly.
Has there been anything concrete at San Francisco? You're saying they...
Generation 5 hasn't produced data on what they're doing, and nobody's producing data at this point. Like they're just starting. Yeah, Generation 5 is 10 years old, 11 years old. Yeah, so they're not, it's still really building, it's still, people are involved in these grassroots community accountability processes, but they're not yet inviting social scientists in to see what's happening. Yeah.
So these community meetings and with your research, how does that affect Fresno State students like myself as members of the community and society as a whole?
Great. So I think we can do a community accountability like driving in the car to school one day. Like this messed up thing happened, and you start talking with your friend about why was it messed up? What happened? What could we do to like prevent that messed up thing from happening again? And maybe that's organizing in a really complex way, or maybe that's making a plan with your friends about how you're going to be accountable to each other and starting to notice each other in a slightly different way. That it's not about always having to call in campus security, or do you have a police force at Fresno?
Yeah.
So it's not calling the police all the time. That's not the only solution. You can step in and say, hey, are you doing okay? Or before you even go out for the night, say, you know, I'm going to get really hammered, but I don't want to go home with anybody. So if you see me get hammered and start to violate that boundary, please keep me accountable to my own boundary. It's doing that work together, that kind of like low-level accountability to one another. So you can do it in the car or on the bus with your friend, I think. And then that kind of pushing back against the way that we've been atomized and told we just have to worry about ourselves and we shouldn't worry about anybody else. Like, we can't not worry about other people. Try walking in a door when somebody's right in front of you, right? You have to negotiate other people all the time. So we can start highlighting what's happening in our own lives. And if we think, well, what would bring about greater justice in my group of friends? We can start thinking explicitly in those ways about it. And we don't have to wait for somebody else to tell us how that's going to happen or institute a process for us. We can take that on. Does that answer your question? Okay. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, please.
I had a question about child sexual abuse, because it seems like a lot of it is driven by pedophilia.
Uh-huh.
How does that fit into this? Because if someone has that, assuming that's a non-curable thing, how does changing their conditions deal with that?
Well, I mean, it's a complex question. If we pathologize things and start saying, there's a penological moment in the middle of the 19th century when we start saying, it's not that people commit certain acts, it's that they are certain kinds of people, right? And I think that discourse has been very powerful, saying, once a something, always a something. You're that kind of person. You've just shown the inner truth of your soul through that act. And I think we're going to have to really push back against that way of understanding people. So we're going to have to stop talking about criminals, for instance, right? And this is Generation 5, what they're saying. We're going to have to stop thinking that people are born to be a certain thing and start thinking about the conditions under which people live.